All right, as a matter of introduction, a few disclaimers. Between 2012 and 2018, I was employed by NICE in the scientific advice team. And this work received no financial support from any organization. And publishing fees have been waived by the BMJ Open, for which I'm quite grateful. We have taken into account that the redacted information is considered to be commercially sensitive by Pfizer and that to disclose it could harm their commercial interests. We have also considered the public interest and the ability of NICE to maintain the confidence of manufacturers to ensure that we can continue to carry out technology appraisals. There is a strong public interest in drug companies participating in the development of NICE technology appraisals to enable us fully to evaluate the clinical and cost effectiveness of a drug for the NHS. We consider that drug companies would be less likely to participate fully in future technology appraisals should this redacted information be disclosed. NICE relies on the confidence of manufacturers to provide highly sensitive commercial information. Without this information, we would not be able to fulfill our statutory functions. If we were to release information provided in confidence, we would not only risk action being taken against us by the owners of the information, but we would also risk losing the confidence of other manufacturers that we're working with currently and will need to work with again in the future. On balance, we therefore believe that protecting the commercial interests of Pfizer and of NICE outweighs the public interest in disclosure, and so we consider the requested information to be exempt from disclosure under Act 41, Section 41 and 43 of the Act. This is the information that was sent by NICE as a response to the Freedom of Information request, which was filed by Till Bruckner in the end of 2018. And this is how the story began. Till dropped me a line in the end of 2018 saying, can you send me some papers from NICE where you think the information is redacted? And it took me about 3 minutes to pull something off the NICE website with blacked out pages. I knew some data was redacted. I never worked in technology appraisals team. I didn't know the extent of data reduction, but I knew that finding one document would be really easy. So, and I sent that document to him with a sarcastic note at the bottom saying, good luck trying to get it, you won't get anything. And Till filled out this request. And at that stage, I didn't even know that freedom of information procedure existed, that you can actually go and ask for the information. And his request was about the single technology appraisal of palbociclib for metastatic HER2-negative breast cancer. And he requested survival information, survival data at year 1, and the prognosis for survival at future years. Needless to say, this request was denied with the statement that I just read to you. And I did know the outcome that Till would get, but I did not expect to read that message. And that message actually shocked me. The phrasing, the coldness of that message, the very clear alignment with the industry agenda and somewhat interesting definition of public and patient interests when we're talking about survival data for an oncology drug. And it was not a product under evaluation at NICE because palbociclib was recommended for the use in NHS 1 year before. So this data was publicly available on the NICE website, this recommendation, and the documents underpinning it. Obviously, you can see the history section, all those documents were there, and this is where we pulled the document for Till to make that request. Then Till had a few arguments with the freedom of information process. This is all documented, and you can go and read those dialogues online. And we didn't leave this alone. And Deborah Winberg, who was a student at LSE at the time, made another request half a year later. And fortunately, survival data was released. And it was released in a form of 1-page PDF file, which is available on the What Do They Want to Know Freedom of Information website. But as you can imagine, no documents on the NICE website were updated. They remain with blacked out boxes. And this really puzzled me and disturbed me. And I wanted to see how big is this problem. And I started digging into this. And at that stage, I could not have imagined that this work would take me 700 hours of my life. And I also realized that it would be not possible to involve someone else in this work or receive any funding for this work. And I didn't even have any expectations of publishing it or making it public at that stage. I just wanted to see how big this problem is and how many appraisals are actually redacted. And this resulted in a lot of time to produce this particular investigation. And by the end of 2019, NICE published appraisal number 600. However, not all of them are fully available on the NICE website due to the process, because recommendations simply are being replaced because new data comes out, or some recommendations are being withdrawn because they lose marketing authorization. So total number of appraisals for evaluation at that stage was 408. And I also added highly specialized technologies, which are for ultra rare diseases. And at that time, only 10 were available. So all of them made it into my analysis. And what I've done, I looked into the background documentation for all these evaluations, and all this is publicly available information. All of this is available on the NICE website. So before I show you the results, I want to give you a few definitions because we will be coming back to them throughout our presentation. So from the NICE process guide, it clearly says that NICE considers it essential that evidence on which the appraisal committee's decisions are based is made available to stakeholders, and it's made publicly available. It also says that information marked as confidential should be kept to an absolute minimum. Data that are likely to be fundamental to the appraisal committee's decision-making cannot be marked as confidential. Now, as I present you with results, remember this definition and think for yourself, what is absolute minimum, how would you define it, and what is essential for decision-making also can be a response to the question. A couple more important definitions before we progress is the definition of commercial in confidence information and academic in confidence. So commercial in confidence is information, the disclosure of which in public could have a significant impact on the commercial interest of a particular company. As part of this work, I looked into regulatory agencies, I looked in the actual problem of data reduction, and I found this very interesting definition from the European Medicines Agency, which has a policy on data reduction according to which clinical data are not considered to be commercially confidential information, besides a few exceptions limited to novel trial designs and exploratory endpoints and biomarkers. So keep this note in mind as well. So academic in confidence is information, the disclosure of which in public would seriously jeopardize the ability of the data owner to publish information in the scientific paper. We'll get back to this discussion as well. So now I'd like to show you what I found through this work, looking at 408 technology appraisals and 10 highly specialized technologies. So data reduction is present in more than 80% of documents. When we look at single technology appraisals, it goes above 90%. When we look at multiple technology appraisals, which look at the number of technologies at a time, it's close to 60%. Interestingly, there is a small number of non-recommended technologies, which are the information is on the website, and data, 75% of data for those, sorry, not 75% of data, but in 75% of appraisals, there is data reduction of some sort. And for HSTs, there's not a single one without some data being redacted. Now, the question is, what is being redacted and how crucial is it? So I looked at 4 key parameters: price, clinical data, QALYs, and adverse events. And those of you not familiar with NICE methodology, QALYs is a measure of clinical benefit, which looks at duration of life, extension of life, and quality of life, and combines it into this one index. So clinical data was looking at very specific issues, let's say outcome endpoints, and then QALYs is just this index which was redacted. So adverse events also I found interesting. And as you see, over time, that the reduction increased dramatically. And in 2007, NICE introduced patient access scheme, which is a discount, a confidential discount that the company can offer to the NHS. And you can see a sharp increase in reduction of price data from that point, and really sharp increase in all indicators over time. So this is over time comparison of proportion of unredacted technology appraisals. As you see, when NICE started, things were pretty open, to very heavily redacted technology appraisals. When I say heavily redacted, of course, it was a subjective judgment on my part, but when you open the document and half of the page is blacked out, and most clinical data is blacked out, or when you open a 300-page document and you count that 160 pages out of that 300-page document have black boxes, I classify these documents as heavily redacted. And you see how much heavy reductions have increased over time. And by looking at the latest technology appraisals, which are not part of this work, I think there was not a single one in 2020 that had no redacted data. This is some findings by company. I only looked at the companies which had 10 or more appraisals with NICE, which were currently active. So Roche had 34, Sanofi had 10. And here you can see proportion of heavily redacted appraisals, those that redacted price and clinical data, those that redacted price or clinical data, not together, and those that were unredacted. So unredacted appraisals do happen, it's just very rare. Then I thought, okay, if this data is not available on a NICE website, maybe it's available somewhere and I should not be just harsh at NICE, and maybe this data is in the public domain and it can be just found somewhere. So I looked at the regulatory agencies and try to see what's going on with clinical study reports, because clinical study reports are a lot more detailed than the information that NICE receives, or can be a lot more detailed. And I thought perhaps this data is there. And I was actually lucky to find just a few, but then I discovered there's a huge problem with regulatory agencies actually publishing clinical study reports on their websites. So here's an appraisal from colorectal cancer, where you can see a lot of adverse events redacted. And very fortunately, I found the clinical study report on the EMA website for exact same product where this exact data can be found. And yes, it is currently available on the EMA website. It is definitely redacted on the NICE website. Nothing has changed. And NICE has now unreduction practices. If something becomes available, it's not been unredacted. I'm actually very puzzled how come the company submitted unredacted documentation to the EMA and found it commercially sensitive for an organization which actually recommends a product into clinical practice, where patients and clinicians might refer to these documents. So there's a couple more examples. So this is outcomes data for metastatic locally advanced cutaneous squamous cell carcinoma. This is the document from the NICE background documentation. And I found in Health Canada a clinical study report that does have this data. But as you can see, tables are formatted differently. That is presented to regulators differently. I could not find the other 3 columns. Perhaps I didn't have enough time to go through everything, but in that particular document in Health Canada website, this data was not identified. Here's one more example for the HER2-negative advanced breast cancer. Also, a high number of adverse events are not available. Health Canada website has all this data. The problem is this comparison is completely happened, I would say almost by chance, because I was lucky to find, to identify these clinical study reports. And these happened after I checked 50 or 100 different drugs for which I wanted to find this data. And these clinical study reports are simply not available on regulatory websites. So if I guess spent another 100 hours, maybe I could have shown you 2 more tables, but I could not show you the tables responding to each reduction on the NICE website. This data is simply nowhere to be found. We can argue that this data could be in journal publications, but that's another question that we'll take for discussion later. So one of the final results is I looked at more specific things which didn't fit into my broad categories of price, qualities, adverse events, and clinical outcomes. So baseline and subgroup patient characteristics were reduced in 12.5% of appraisals. Data on modeling and direct comparisons was not available in over 20% of appraisals. Economic modeling was pretty much available, but still some were redacted. So clinical or modeled outcomes data was designated as commercial in confidence in 10% of appraisals. Very interesting, in almost 7% of appraisals, comments from academic groups and criticism from committee were redacted. And that, to me, I found extremely puzzling, because this is absolutely crucial information for patients, for clinicians, for the public to know what exactly committee criticized. And this is also very important outcome, because this concerns NICE methodology and in terms of using cost per quality approach to establishment of clinical effectiveness. I looked at appraisals which had clinical data redacted when price data was available, because there are arguments when you have to redact clinical data if you redact price, otherwise you can back calculate qualities. So I identified 93 out of 170 appraisals where clinical data was redacted while price data was not confidential. So, and that information that I showed you, that analysis, comes from the background documentation. So from history pages. Final appraisal determination is the document which is written in a layman's language in a way for people without specific education to clearly understand the recommendation from NICE. This is designed for the public, this is designed for patients, this is designed for clinicians. And this is actually a committee decision. And here I found that 25% of these final appraisal determination withheld at least some clinical data. These documents cannot be blacked out. You have no black boxes there, but I clearly say that the information is withheld as commercial in confidence or academic in confidence. And I pulled out a couple interesting examples for you. So here's an example for appraisal of hepatic encephalopathy. And here the company indicated that the treatment-related adverse events, severe adverse events, and adverse events that resulted in people stopping the study were commercial in confidence and therefore cannot be reported here. Another example is even more disturbing. It's for ABPI for adolescents. And here you see that the data on the incidence of clinically significant weight gain at 30 weeks was considered to be academic in confidence by the manufacturer, and therefore cannot be reported in this document. And data on the proportion of participants with BMI or of above 95 percentile at 30 weeks considered to be academic in confidence. And this is very disturbing, because you can imagine that for parents, for clinicians, this could be critically important information. These documents remain on the NICE website as they are. So even if this information is available somewhere and no longer confidential on the NICE website, it is still not available. For these appraisals, I could not find any clinical study reports on EMA and Health Canada websites. So not that it requires some other searchers to try to identify this information. So very fortunately, my article was published yesterday, so you can see all the results and read full text on this website. And I put the repository of data in the open space, so you can download the file where each appraisal is listed with my ratings, and you can disagree, let's say, with how I graded data redaction practices, but it also identifies for each appraisal specifically on which pages what data was redacted. And my hope for this work was to actually have this Excel file available for NICE so they can go page by page and unredact this data at some point. But the big question, okay, I did this work. The big question is, who cares? For 20 years, no one cared. Obviously, if patients and clinicians cared enough, they could have rang the bell sooner. So the system works, and it has been working. It will continue to work. So some people cared, and Sturgeon and Lindman requested EMA and NICE to revise their policies on data transparency, suggesting that they should change the default data unavailability to actual access to data. Pentelling colleagues called for more transparency in HTA documents. Bullman and his colleagues actually did very important work before me. They looked at 100 technology appraisals, which had the confidential price agreement, and they found the data redaction level egregious. This was never noticed by NICE. None of this was a big deal to anyone, and nothing was obviously changed. So calls for transparency across the board have been growing. And I think, of course, the success of All Trials campaign and the work done by TransparyMed, where the request for publishing clinical trial results, making them available online, has been successful. And at that stage, NICE quite supported transparency. And this is the statement from the chairman of NICE from 2014. I can see no reason whatsoever not to publish all the data that I think there is a moral imperative from the point of view of the patients who've been part of the trials, that their time, their effort shouldn't be ignored. I think everything should be in the public domain, and I've always felt that way very strongly. I do suspect our chairman never bothered to read any final appraisal determination or to see any background documentation to even know that NICE redacts data and how much data is being redacted. So of course, these are empty words, these are political statements which lead into nothing. But the whole dialogue of transparency is actually very controversial. And I don't know, perhaps you joined this talk because you believe that transparency is important. There are many groups which believe otherwise, and some of these groups I actually respect a lot. And one of the dialogues in terms of price transparency, people working in low-income middle countries strongly argue that if you make pricing transparent, the incredible discounts that lower middle-income countries receive on pharmaceuticals, they will lose it. And I think it's a valid argument. I agree with it, but also it makes you think just how sick of a system we have built, that we are captured in this kind of dialogue where pharma completely rules the game, saying, well, if you make anything transparent, we will not give access to drugs to people who can barely afford it. And the difference in prices is indeed tremendous. Sofosbuvir was breaking budgets in the Western world, and it was made really available for $80, I think, for course of treatment for India. So yes, there is a lot that happens that to make availability of drugs, but it has to happen through kind of not a very good route. So unfortunately, UK has a very strong stance on not supporting transparency. This is 2 years old. This is from 2019. And UK decided not to sign the resolution on supporting transparency of pricing. And it's clear because this is pre-Brexit. There's extremely strong lobbying from the industry, threatening the UK government that they will pull production, that they will pull the industry from the country as part of Brexit. So that was the key consideration, I guess, not to support it. So Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry and NICE, they work together and they have a joint statement on what they think should be confidential. And this is the information from this document. And they believe that only information that is genuinely confidential, such as the actual numbers, should be marked as in confidence. and NICE will only treat information in confidence if the material is in fact commercial in confidence or academic in confidence. So you've seen the results, you've seen that the documents that are produced are there by themselves, and the reality has nothing to do with the statements. So ABPI, of course, has their own agenda. They very much support transparency in the way they understand it, and they congratulate themselves on making trial results available, which indeed is better than it was before. But you can also see that in the UK, it's a huge industry sector. These are the promises that ABPI is making in terms of making data available and engaging patients, engaging the public, trying to bring the clinical trial results. So, and here's an example. Glaxo opened access to the data in 2,500 trials, but once again, to the information that they wanted to show, that they wanted to release. And there's an interesting book that came out recently on transparency. And I think it is quite controversial because it doesn't take the stance that transparency is the only way forward, that transparency is good. Till wrote a great review on this, and there are different positions. And basically, here's one of them. Transparency does not always translate into real life benefits. Making data accessible does not automatically result in more data being assessed. And too much transparency can drive decision-making process underground. So that's one position. And here's another interesting position. Does more better information automatically lead to better patient care? It's true that in the case of Tamiflu, producers of clinical practice guidelines seem to largely unmoved by new information. And this is true that decision makers, when the information becomes available, don't act on this. However, we have rather little evidence to compare the world with fully available information with the world where information is not available, because we are living in this latter example where information is not being fully disclosed. And all the arguments saying, well, whether we disclose it or not will not change the situation. It's a theory. And even if it's not, perhaps it's going to take a lot of time before it becomes a status quo, before it becomes acceptance. And obviously, each political group, each stakeholder has their very strong views on what's right and what's wrong. So just a few words on regulators in terms of how they make data available. So once again, on paper, it all looks politically correct. European Medicines Agency started releasing clinical study reports back in 2015. Then in 2018, they said that they are overwhelmed, they're too busy, they have no resources, and they stopped doing that. And then they started releasing clinical data again only on COVID-related products, and nothing else is being released at the moment. FDA said, okay, let's do a pilot in 2018. They ran a pilot. I think they disclosed data on one drug. They had many consultations, and they came to conclusion that it should be harmonized effort across all agencies, and they will not be releasing clinical study reports. They will not be releasing further data. It just needs some kind of institutional solution at some point in the future. Health Canada is doing quite well. I haven't done assessment of how much data they released. They started releasing clinical study reports in 2019. A lot of information can be found, but of course there's a huge backlog of what happened before 2019. So yes, data is available on Health Canada website. How much on how many products is I don't know. It's better than the previous two agencies I described, but it's not complete, and it might never be complete. So I'd like to draw your attention to a very interesting example in Germany. Federal Joint Committee and Institute for Quality and Efficiency in Healthcare are the two organizations which in combination represent, so to speak, health technology assessment procedures within Germany. And they had a big reform back in 2011, and they put forward a strong legal basis for transparency on data availability. And they have a law in place whereby the assessment of all new drugs that enter the German market requires that a submission of complete data from the manufacturer and the information relating to the underlying decision-making in the public domain. And I think for NICE, I think for other HTA agencies, this is an extremely strong precedent, because as you have seen from the statement that I read to you in the very beginning of this talk, there's a very clear message of how important it is for NICE to maintain a friendly relationship with the industry, because otherwise the industry will not come to NICE, and then we will not be able to make decisions. And here, UK definitely cannot say that they're the first market of launch in Europe or in the area, since we're not in Europe any longer. Germany is and remains so. And I think this kind of argument in terms of industry pulling out of the country is also political games, because German pharmaceutical industry is extremely strong, and I haven't measured it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's bigger than in the UK. And so this precedent for transparency exists. So fortunately, we have Beate Wiesler from IGWIC who joined us today. So perhaps she can comment during discussion that it is possible to be transparent. And you may ask me, okay, if we have this data in Germany, why can't we just use it? Well, it's in German, and it's not possible to expect that patients from the UK would know that there are websites somewhere in Europe where they can look up certain information, plus different drugs have been appraised at different times, and not all drugs have been appraised by every country. All right, so what are the chances that the situation improves? Do I believe that the work I've done can change anything? Honestly, I don't know. Of course, I want to believe so. In the reality, chances are extremely slim. NICE started taking money from the industry for the technology appraisal process in 2019. This exacerbates the conflict of interest, and obviously industry has a lot of power to tell to NICE what they want to have confidential, what they want to have redacted, otherwise they will not pay, and otherwise they will not come for an appraisal. And sorry, NICE is a part of the system. It's a part of big innovation agenda, which is being promoted by the country for economic growth, and it's part of the business. So there are stronger interests than disclosure of endpoints or disclosure of adverse events, and how logical or illogical it is, it's not, I guess, for us to judge. And there's another problem with NICE in terms of methodology, because NICE uses cost per quality assessment for the establishment of cost effectiveness. It is true what Bullman and his colleagues raised in the paper, that if we have to redact price data, by default, we may have to redact some clinical data, which can be used for otherwise back calculation of price becomes possible. And other HTA agencies don't use this approach, for example, and they might not be faced with this particular issue. So that's why I could have personally taken a stance saying, okay, let's just at least release clinical data if we cannot make prices visible. Unfortunately, it's this kind of vicious cycle where one thing is connected to another, and making this call might not always be possible. But as I demonstrated to you, there's a very high proportion of appraisals where price is available while clinical data is still being redacted. So there are many precedents for improvement. On a positive note, NICE does a lot better than many other agencies. Its processes are transparent. It includes stakeholders. It listens to different voices. It does have public consultations. It takes public consultation comments into consideration seriously. Meetings are open to the public, and you can attend them and listen to the deliberations. And in the end, in the grand scheme of things, what matters, NHS prices are significantly lower than in the US. Whether prices are lower than in Europe, this is unknown, because we can never do this comparison. This information is confidential across the board. I can tell you one anecdotal story. I don't know how true it is, but when I worked at NICE, we had a contact from someone in Brazil who told us they try to figure out how much money is being paid for a particular product. They went on a NICE website, and the NICE website lists prices which don't include the confidential discount for some drugs. And they thought it was the real price. And they negotiated with a pharmaceutical company the price, which was, I think, either equal to it or just slightly higher. And then they figured out that the product has a massive discount they didn't know what was the discount, but it had a big discount in the UK. So Brazil ended up paying significantly more for that product. So it's all very controversial, and on one hand, there might be benefits for some countries, on the other hand, might be not. To finalize, this is my wish list. So I would like to see all data in NICE appraisals being unredacted, even if it's now useful for research purposes only. And going forward, of course, I hope data will not be redacted. I think the data should be, the policy should be reviewed at NICE, and it shouldn't be just a document, it should be a document which is acted upon. I feel very strongly about abolishing academic and confidence data redaction in any of its expressions, because I actually wrote to BMJ group, and they said that all of their journals will accept the articles with data which was published on EMA, FDA, regulatory NICE websites. And I think regulatory websites by default should be treated as preprint server. This is essential. This information comes out openly to the public before any publications. And it's just disservice to the public that this whole academic and confidence data redaction exists. And this is something that journal editors should take very seriously and make clear statements on their websites encouraging authors, or that the acceptance of the paper will not depend on the fact that it was disclosed on the regulatory website. And yes, I hope at some point regulators will actually start publishing clinical study reports in full. We do need to build a better system across the board. It's not just about NICE. It's about perception of transparency. It's about other stakeholders working in the system, and it's about actually using the data that's available and knowing that it actually exists. So for this work, I'm extremely grateful to Elisa Hutchinson, who helped me review the manuscript, to Till Bruckner and Deborah Winberg, who filed Freedom of Information requests, to Beate Wiesler, who reviewed my work, and to Eli Gajraj, and to a few of my former colleagues who really helped me with very fruitful discussions to make this work happen. So now I'd like to leave you with these messages and open for discussion. I hope I can answer your questions. I think it's a very controversial topic. It's not a one-way answer. Yes, I feel strongly that transparency is essential, but other people don't think so, and they find threats in it. So I'd like to hear from you. I'd like to hear your comments. Thank you. So if you could bring your cameras back on, there are a few comments here. So there's one comment from Kath Sansom about why NICE started taking money. Yes, there is a link on the website. If you go to the news in 2019, NICE budget was cut by 25%. And in order to resolve this shortage, they said, well, EMA and FDA take the money from the industry. Why shouldn't we? And this is the way to finance technology appraisal process. And you can read more about it on that website. And there's a question from Anya. Doesn't the problem already start when looking at the trial registration and the fact that studies have finished a decade ago and still haven't provided results? True, Anya, that could be the problem, but fewer and fewer studies are there. And we're talking about studies which are registered right now. Vast majority of studies on the NICE website currently are registered, and they might have even papers published. So it's part of the problem, but not entirely the problem. All right, I think I addressed the comments in the chat. Any questions from you? Any comments? So Frank, you go first and then Dan.
Yes, hello everyone. Indeed, we also have the observation that quality of life data in particular are less reported and considered as company confidential information. So this is confirming your observation also, yeah.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, unfortunate finding. Dan?
Thanks, Leeza. Great presentation. And I was actually trying to read the paper at the same time while you were doing the presentation, which was also really, really compelling. Yeah, I have a couple of observations, and one of them is really, it was really striking, and I know about the language that's used to discriminate from NICE and other HTA bodies, discriminate what would be considered academic in confidence or commercial in confidence, and it's restrictive sounding language that largely seems to have been ignored. And I know the language that well because I think we stole a lot of it when I developed the same policy at ICER. The one feature, we had a lot of internal debate about it, the one feature that's different in the way ICER approaches this is that there's a time limit. So at 18 months, all redacted data becomes public, whether it's published or not. And that's, I think in some ways it's a good feature, but it also just changes the pressure. So industry pressure is now being put on ICER to keep information redacted at that time point. And it's a real challenge. And I think it feels to me like for any HTA organization, it goes back to enforcing those restrictions to begin with.
Dan, my question to you is, does ICER actually act on that and they go back and they unredact all the documents?
They do.
That's fantastic because NICE obviously does not and never did. So, and I think that is a huge problem, and that's how things are. And once again, you say in the first place, you can see the egregiousness of data redaction. I think there's absolutely no justification for that level of redaction to start with. And of course, if you look at actual documents, it's a huge job to go back and unredact. So the less you redact, there's a more chance you will actually unredact it. But thank you for these comments. And it's actually great to hear that ICER acts on that. And obviously with an example of Germany, example of the US, it is possible. Beate, thank you for raising the hand. Go ahead.
Yes, yes, thank you for this interesting presentation. Maybe a comment and one question. So I just would like to confirm that the situation in Germany is indeed completely different, which at the same time shows how easy in principle this problem could be solved. So I found it striking when you were reading this NICE statement that there are worries that companies are less likely to participate in the process of health technology assessment, or that that NICE would lose the confidence of the companies. Actually, we don't discuss any of that in Germany. There just is a law, and the company is obliged to submit the data, and we are obliged to publish all that data, and there is no discussion about any of these issues. Rather, on the contrary, there has been a study on on how this whole process is viewed by different stakeholders recently, after 10 years of being in place. And there was overall positive feedback also from industry, for example, because of the predictability of the process. So there really isn't any discussion about redaction of data. And so I think in principle, the solution seems pretty easy. You need a good law, and then the problem is solved. I have a question. Maybe I missed that in your presentation, but do you know what percentage of the redaction is commercially confidential or academic in confidence? Because I feel that academic in confidence right now is a smokescreen argument from companies who understand that commercially confidential clinical data isn't acceptable anymore. I mean, why would academic in confidence be acceptable? But then they're kind of shifting the responsibility to the researcher, whom they paid and commissioned, by the way. So do you have any data on the percentage, the distribution of these two types?
That's really tricky, Beate, because actually I don't, and here's the reason why this percentage is really difficult to calculate. I think I have in my data, it's been a long time when I actually looked at the data file, I do have appraisals marked that have AAC, but they might have commercial in confidence as well. And it depends. So basically, this is what happened. If you answer manufacturer's submission by design, this is commercial in confidence. Well, not really. They might have they might say there's a paper we want to publish, it's academic in confidence. So where this data is very clearly listed, and this is documented, it's on my file, is my analysis of final appraisal determinations. But they focus on only those 25% of appraisals that did not black out the box. They say, this information cannot be presented as it is academic in confidence or commercial in confidence. You can read the words. When you look at blackout boxes, it's my judgment call. So there are a few appraisals where ERG document clearly says this is CIC or AIC, but unfortunately it's poorly marked. The problem is, I would say at my personal feeling, CIC is higher, but AIC is extremely high. So it's not, let's say 10% versus 90%. This is 40 to 60. So this is extremely close. So exact percentages are not clear, but there's a lot of academic in confidence data reduction. And even just the review of FADS, which is available, can clearly show you that this is unacceptable. And if these papers are published, no one ever bothers to go back and redact. And this is the comment actually I wanted to get back to in my presentation. Yes, some of this data, which is blacked out on the NICE appraisals, is in the published papers. Some of those adverse events could be in New England Journal of Medicine in the table. But the point is, the NICE positions itself that they're serving the public, they're serving the patients, they're serving clinicians and NHS, plus NICE's influences is such that, as I heard, doctors from many countries Google up the NICE website and read up the stuff. So the audience for NICE is huge, and they are the source. They should be positioning themselves as a source rather than pushing a person go read the New England Journal of Medicine, trying to figure out how to download supplement, trying to understand that it's okay for researchers like us, for example, but it's not the purpose that NICE should be serving. And it's just the fact that it's somewhere doesn't mean that it's transparency. So yeah, unfortunately, don't have exact answer for you, but I think is extreme need to abolish academic in confidence completely and really redefine commercial in confidence. Just then says absolute tolerance of 18 months, and at that stage you make everything published regardless. So David, next question. David, you are muted. I do not hear you.
I'd know by now, wouldn't you? I don't think you mentioned the MHRA, because they are equally secretive when you ask them stuff. I put a link in the
That's very good point. And the reason I didn't, because we were still in the transition, and at the stage when this work was conducted, MHRA was pretty much not making decisions on any pharmaceuticals. All decisions on which NICE looked were EMA decisions. So at that stage, of course, MHRA looks massively at devices. So it's exact same problem with all regulators, and exact same pressure from the industry. And I think MHRA is likely to suffer exact same problems as NICE because they're being lobbied by exact same organizations. It's, I think, to me, very much in the UK, it's a political question, because I think information that the ETA provided, that in Germany, it's not even a discussion, and this is the first market of launch, and this is a center of pharmaceutical industry. You just say, that's the new world, good luck. And UK business is scared to do so, and that's why we are in the situation that we're in. So there is a comment from Klein. I'm not sure about your comment. Would you like to explain exactly what you mean? Because you say that other clinical trial data can be published without a problem if quality related data is redacted, or is there another commercial problem? That's the whole point I'm trying to demonstrate. There is a lot of clinical data which is redacted. It has nothing to do with qualis. Qualis is just yet another problem. So it's not like that much of clinical data, as I showed you, just those two examples on Abilify and another product where very important clinical data was not there. Those products did not have the discount. So is there something you'd like to clarify? Okay, let's move on. Lydia and then Anya.
Yes, thank you for a great presentation, Lisa. I really enjoyed it. And I think it's indeed very timely, because I think we really, in Europe now, we should take the lessons learned from what happened with NICE, now that we will start with joint clinical assessment. I think it's really the right time to do it right from the start. That's what I'm really hoping for. And now, especially with the open public consultation for the pharma legislation, I think those are the type of things that we all have to put in and to flag and to make sure both other aspects that you mentioned, also to EMA, that they have to restart what has been suspended because of the move, like so the publication and the uptake of the CSR. And something else along the same line, they did the same thing with the IPDs, the individual patient data, that also has been suspended, that whole project. So I think we should push hard that those two activities are reactivated within EMA. That's one of my thoughts. Another thought where we are working on, even though we are a small non-profit funder, but I think there should be funder policies on data transparency. That's something that Till Bruckner, well, he's helping us out on that. And yeah, maybe also for Frank, for governmentally supported trials, it should be in the contracts that data sharing and not only study reports, but even IPDs should be shared. And that's, by the way, a box in the clinicaltrials.gov where you see what the strategy is on data sharing. So you can easily check which trials will look at that. And then finally, another party that I think can play an important role is indeed the journals, because I know that PLOS Medicine has a policy on that really you cannot publish if data cannot be traced back. So yeah, maybe Lisa can comment on that. I don't know. I just by accident know that PLOS Medicine has a policy on that, which other journals are working along the same lines. But I think if New England Journal and the Lancet would do that, it might have some impact, no?
Sorry, maybe I'll thank you, Liddy, for that question. And I do think that there's more that journals can do, certainly the mainstream ones like Lancet, New England in particular. You're right that PLOS is kind of trying to forge ahead with that. But I also think that even when we have studies where they're not published anyway in a sort of trial manuscript, if you like, you've also got to remember that even a New England paper or a Lancet paper, they're 15, 20 pages long, whereas the actual clinical study reports with all the patient data in total is running to 800-900 pages. So even then, it's only a synopsis really of the full data. So it's not quite the same as having the data that might be accessible to HTAs, where they're actually getting the fuller sort of tranche of data. Leeza, just congratulations to you, 700 hours of work. And I bet in a way it was one of those projects that when you started delving in, it became more of a quagmire, even more of a project than you perhaps had anticipated. And if nothing else, what you've done is to highlight that we didn't even know what the redaction levels were in something like NICE's 20 years worth of data. At least your article shows that, as well as highlighting the problems between academic in confidence as well as commercial in confidence. And kind of what we don't want to do is abolish AIC purely then to shift it across into CIC and kind of end up having the same data just being moved from one domain to another. But I do think that really the problem still has to be that all the while we have a revolving door between regulatory bodies where they accept a large amount of money from the very industries they're supposed to be regulating, and we have that a level of what can only be described, in my opinion, as corruption, we're not really going to make much headway. I mean, I am interested, however, that the fact that you've got, you know, no redaction policies in somewhere like Germany, and that it's law that they have to have all this data in the sort of transparent domain. I just wondered if there's any comment from any of the other audience members on how that has actually enabled, for example, more quality of life data or more clinically relevant data in looking at sort of longitudinally on how that has maybe helped make better clinical decisions as a result of that data being in the public domain. Is that something that Beat can maybe comment on?
Was that directed to me? Yes,
yeah.
I can try to comment on that. Yeah, actually, we after some time of this project of these processes, evaluated the amount of data that became available via this process. So we looked at the dossiers that were submitted and published, and the reports that were submitted published in this process. And compared the clinical data included in this documentation with the European Public Assessment reports, journal publications, and registry reports, and a combination of all of that. So we compared the newly available information with all the other information that had been available at that point in time. And we are talking of market entry, so that is very early. And as Leeza pointed out, Germany usually is an early market entry, so it's just after the regulatory approval. And what we found was that in the documentation of this health technology assessment process, about 90% of all principally available clinical data were available indeed from this process, while the combination of all other documents in the public domain, that is EPAR publications and registry reports, provided just 50% of all clinical data from available at the point of market entry. So we thought that that was quite impressive. I mean, we hadn't expected that the difference was so huge. So in principle, this shows also how important health technology assessment could be for patients and their physicians, and also for obviously for decision making on a societal level. Do we know that this has affected clinical care? I think we can't, there is no investigation into that. We at one point looked to what extent our reports were cited in clinical guidelines, and there is room for improvement, I must say. but for example, it has now been decided that the outcome of this assessment process will be brought to each physician's screen in their practice. So we would hope that this improves uptake, at least of the decisions based on this data. But actually, it's difficult to say to what extent this really changed patient care. But I think it's the inevitable first step to go, make the information available and then start from there.
Yeah, thank you for that. And congratulations again, Leeza, because it's a huge project you've done.
Thank you for these comments. And just one quick response. I think it's very important to understand that redacted data doesn't mean unavailable data. Committee sees all this data, and this is very patronizing in a sense that to public and the patients, it's communicated saying, on the behalf of those who didn't see the data, we made that decision. So it's an ability to recheck, it's an ability to go back. And it's actually, I think, because I showed you what type of data is redacted, I don't understand how a clinician can go and say, listen, I don't know how it's going to make you feel. All this data is actually redacted on adverse events, but NICE said yes, so you should be okay. So you can't have a granular discussion with the patient, I think. So it's one thing, but I think what Beate refers to is also very important. They pushed for even more data even being presented in the first instance. So, and then quick response to Lydia's comment. As you've seen, AMA really a pro releasing data, and they do not actually, if you see clinical study report online, it's actually unredacted. It's amazing. So they claim that they have no capacity, they have no resources, and this is the reason why they're not doing it. So this is completely administrative process. Now, EMA is 87% funded by the industry. So they should take more money from the industry to release the data. It's like another vicious circle. And this is, I guess, a call to the European Parliament, where they should say, this is, look, locked budget, use that money, use these 3 people to put all clinical study reports online. This is all resolvable. This is a matter of really quick decision, very small resources on the grand scheme of budgets in the European Union. Same thing with NICE. You can look at the NICE budgets and the surplus they currently have in terms of the financial reporting. This is publicly available information. Can NICE do it? They're not just overwhelmed, they are beyond overwhelmed with COVID. So this is very poor resourcing, sorry. They need to hire people who can focus on unredaction, developing these policies, and stop redacting data in the first place. So, and these are administrative issues that just are not resolved. So, okay, Anya, and then I think Frank had his head up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep, good. Okay, I was just thinking about in the same lines as before, the fact that you mentioned that if you use a QALY, it's probably already true that companies have to deliver a completely different data set to those that want to use QALYs than, for example, to the German agency. So when the Germans can publish unredacted, then isn't that also due to the fact that they do not have to reveal this type of data that then allows, back calculating of all kind of things, which is built into the cost utility analysis system? And then somebody said, well, the HDAC probably more data than EMA. No way. Submission at EMA is 50,000 pages. There is so much information in there that obviously is automatically generated by the companies. So they would never ever redact 50,000 pages, for example. But we know that one of our biggest problems is that the amount of information is reduced with every stakeholder that takes a look and makes a report. And we also know that the EPAR, for example, if you ask general practitioners out there if they know what an EPAR is, they will most probably tell you they have no clue. They rely completely on the SMPC, which in the end is an extremely limited piece of information And that only contains the absolute essential that is considered relevant for the prescriber, I would say. So we lose information along the line, not just only by redacting, but even by the fact that I know what I see on a regulatory approval for a drug, and I know what I get as a submission for HTA. And those are really worlds between these two submissions and the amount of information I can get. So it's already very, very redacted by the industry, what they submit to the HTAs. We do not see for an HTA submission all the sub-studies, all the sub-information, all the adverse event reports that have been in there. We already get aggregated, cleaned up, washed data. They show us only what they want us to show. And they also make sure that they try to present it in such a way that even the most intelligent people will find it extremely hard to backtrace it, to the original information, even in publications like you yourself have experienced. You can't find the same information in the publication, and that is also very deliberate from the industry. So I think it really lies in essence in the fact that we have not found a way to ensure that the contribution of patients demands full transparency on what they have contributed, because the data is belonged by the company, not by the patients that have been participating in a trial. And if we would have a policy that very clearly states if someone contributes to the development of a drug and the generation of healthcare data, then they have an absolute right to full transparency, then all the other attempts and tricks the industry has would fall apart. And that, I think, is something that you can even demand simply on the fact that we have the Helsinki Declaration.
Anya, very important comments. So thank you so much for this, and completely agree with you on everything you've said. And Beate just commented that CSRs are submitted. I think sometimes NICE receives CSRs as well, but they're not published on in the history documents for appraisals. You're right, documents are packaged completely differently because we're one step away from marketing, from influencing patients, from influencing clinicians. And it's important to remove some information there, which may scare patients and clinicians. And I think this is why HTAs get so much data redacted, so to sort of smooth those corners. And I 100% agree with you that the cost per quality methodology is the root of the problem. But if you see if you go into my Excel document, you'll see the egregious data reduction. Much of that doesn't have anything to do with cost per quality and calculating back the potential discounts. So if it was kept only to those instances, maybe life would not be that bad. And as Dan says, if it was all unredacted 18 months later, no matter what, but that's not the world we live in. So any other comments? So Lydia, you still have your hand up. Is there another?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was just thinking of data repositories because the US is much better organized for that. And is that something we could also ask for Europe? Because I'm not sure if the US systems even pick up the data from Europe. Why don't we have those systems up and running is my question.
Very good question, very good challenge. Beate, any thoughts?
Yes, I would absolutely agree. I mean, having the regulator as a first point of contact and as a starting point for entry of all these drugs to the market, I think EMA could also be a data hub and request all the individual patient data for combined use by the healthcare systems. I mean, that wouldn't even be any additional workload for the companies because they have to prepare these data sets for the FDA anyway, as Lydie mentioned. So, I mean, there is much talk about the European health data space. I think this could be part of it. So bring all data to EMA and then have analysis across companies, across drugs, to generate the information we need for decision making. I think there is so much more to learn from this data than we do now by just having one company very isolated looking at their own data. I think we could really gain much more information out of such a system. And it might be a possibility to discuss that in the context of the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation in Europe, which just has started.
Yeah. We have time until December 21st to submit all our ideas, but I think everybody should.
Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Beate. Anya, you have another comment?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, one of the inputs that the pharma legislation absolutely needs is the message that the data that is used and is deemed sufficient to establish benefit risk is of such lousy quality by now that it doesn't allow any real robust decisions on downstream stakeholders, and that the concept of how the regulators interpret absolute benefit versus relative effectiveness is a core problem we are having. Because I mean, the reduction problem is going to be a small problem when in the end the whole documentation is pretty much one spreadsheet of a couple of data points and nothing else anymore. And the quality of the data that we are getting is so poor by now that all the HTAs are increasingly frustrated, I think, and they are rightfully blaming the regulators, and I agree on that. And I think the only way forward is that the European Commission is going to be told by 1 million people that I'm not interested in whether drug X works theoretically. I'm interested whether it works better than A, B, C, and in which order I should take them. And I'm not the only one. Every patient, every general practitioner, every HTA, and every payer wants this question answered, not the other question that is constantly answered, but is not going to help any of us.
Anya, thank you so much. I hope you can join our event in 2 weeks. This is exactly the topic. So the quality of data submitted for HTA for discussion. So just a heads up. Okay, any feedback on Anya's comments? Beate, go ahead, please.
Yes, Anna, thank you. Anya, thank you for this intervention. I do agree that the decreasing quality of the studies and data that is provided is a problem. You also being part of a regulator is why, could you give us any idea why EMA is going down that line? I mean, in the end, it's a regulator's decision to also accept this data and come to positive approval decisions based on that data.
Yeah, I know. And it's like I say, there are different perspectives. And also within the system, the regulatory system, there are increasing voices that say we are not answering the right question. We shouldn't go down that road. But what we have seen is argumentations that go into the direction of something is no longer feasible. And I have a colleague that always insists that you have to make a difference between not feasible, impossible, or inconvenient. And the FDA has been on the forefront of making sure that inconvenient was almost a synonym for not feasible. So the moment the company started arguing that the patients don't want to participate in comparative trials anymore, we can only do single-arm trials. And by the way, there's this miracle tool, the real-world data. We started setting in motion a chain reaction, because when you allow a single-arm trial one time, as a consequence, you would raise the bar for others if you would then suddenly demand that they have a comparative trial. And that is a very strong argument in the system not to do that. And then it's very logical. If A got away with very little, then B, C, D also demand to get away with very little information. And I think the one tool that really has caused the biggest problem is the conditional marketing authorization, because it was intended for something very, very different. But the way it has developed in recent years, and as I say, it has to do with almost individuals in the system that are pushing towards saying this is enough to establish an absolute effect. That has led to a situation where we increasingly see this extremely poor documentation, where there is some data generation promised later. The conditional marketing authorization has a built-in default that you have to prove your efficacy or your safety at a later stage. But by giving conditional marketing authorization, you're making it impossible to run these trials in a comparative setting. And as a consequence, we have seen a whole bunch of these studies coming saying, well, yeah, but there is a conditional marketing authorization. So there is by definition no possibility for a comparative trial. And I must also say, I know quite a couple of patient representatives that consistently say comparative trials are unethical. And you know, all these parties contribute to this development in a direction where we as HTAs are completely frustrated and say, you cannot make €1 million decision on that kind of evidence, because that is what we have to do. And I think the regulatory system has simply slowly moved themselves in a corner, and they cannot get out of it unless the European Commission would finally give them a new mandate, because that is what really is at the core of the problem. The EMA and the regulators have interpreted their mandate in such a way that it's not their task to make sure that drugs are comparative in the assessment A versus B. They say, I only look at A. That is what they need to prove to me, that they have a benefit that is larger than the risk. And that is not the question that most of us would like to see answered. And I know that, and many other people know it too. But it's, as I say, it's the EMA's interpretation of their mandate. They have been given by the European Commission. The new pharma legislation is a place where we have a chance to insist that this interpretation is no longer possible, that the message from the European Commission must be a different one, that regulators have to facilitate with their assessment downstream processes, which then in reality lead to access to drugs for patients.
Could we initiate a declaration initiative where we get millions of people around Europe, all patients and relevant stakeholders, to sign something that can't then be ignored by governments worldwide, to create a new movement along the lines you've just said?
If we could, I would definitely sign it, because you know, I'm tomorrow's patient, and I know exactly what's broken in the system. I know exactly what I want to see changed, but it's very, very difficult, even if you're in the system, and I'm one of these people that are participating in all these regulatory processes, you know.
Maybe we can get some independent lawyers or legal advisors, and if we were to sort of, you know, have like-minded people that were to get together with this, irrespective of the industry, that's a powerful collective voice, and it would be difficult for them to at least not, you know, sort of discuss it at a more sort of head up or higher level. It can't just be ignored if they get millions of signatures.
Leeza, and I
sure.
suggest we take this discussion into our next event, because this is exactly what is planned. So this was about data reduction. So I really much appreciate you staying over time and for really, really great debate. We do have a couple more comments from Frank and Lydia, which I will take, but since some of you are disconnecting, I would be very grateful to, some people already emailed me or just send a message, and if you have ideas of how we can move step by step in terms of let's try at least fight for transparency to begin with, how we can make this difference. As I told you, I was not the first person to raise this issue. For decades, it's been NICE has been criticized for not for redacting data. regulators were not putting clinical study reports. All these issues are resolvable with absolute minimal resources. Yes, legislation needs to be put in place. But if you do have suggestions of how this can practically be fixed, drop me a line, because of course I do want to continue working on this. Let's take 2 more comments and wrap up today's session. So Frank and then Lydia, please.
So Leeza, this was a great meeting and should be continued, and definitely with Anja, I also want to continue the discussion on, because the whole problem is that this was predictable. When we had more than 10 years ago, the first meeting, UNETA with EMA at the floors of ICWIC, I remember well, and this was predicted, in fact, that this would happen. And now that in the US, yesterday I checked also for medical devices, even they are also going to this accelerated route of approval. And fortunately there with the healthcare payers, they got the wisdom to sit together, FDA and the healthcare payers jointly for the assessment. So perhaps it's something also to consider here. Over.
Thank you, Frank. Lydia.
Yeah, I just want to finish and refer to Rita Kessler if she is still in, because she has been very active and collecting signatures and obtaining a result on a transparency case with EMA. So maybe there are some ideas there.
Yeah, I think Rita disconnected, but this is recorded, so hopefully these messages can be passed forward. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for your thoughts and your ideas. And let's see, we will be keeping updates on our website on whether we managed to succeed. Last night, I did email to the CEO of NICE requesting for this change to be made. She promised to look into the issue. Let's see what the world holds for us in the future. Maybe step by step, there will be little wins. So I appreciate your support. I appreciate your interest. So I will see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.